All right, good afternoon. We're going to reconvene our meeting and continue talking about forests and fragmentation and add forestry with Forester Charlie Hancock from Northwoods Forestry. Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity, Chair Sheldon and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Charlie Hancock. I'm a consulting forester with Northwoods Forestry based in Montgomery. I work across the northern tier of the state as a consulting forester. I think I have one of the best jobs in the world. The Washington Post recently confirmed that with their story. I don't know if you saw it on professions with the happiest, least stressful, most meaningful jobs. And forestry, logging, and ag was right on top. I think sometimes their measurement of stress might be off, but still, it's one of the best jobs. I get to go play in the woods every day and bring my dog to work. In addition to my work at Northwoods Forestry, I'm also a co-founder of Cold Hollow to Canada, which is a regional conservation partnership based up at the northern end of the Greens. I'm working for the past decade on conservation for stewardship-related issues. I also wear a few different hats. I'm the vice chair of the state's Working Lands Enterprise Board, currently serve on the Forest Futures Advisory Panel, and I'm a member of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee on the Vermont Climate Council. Thank you so much for the invitation today. I got to say it was a little open-ended. Usually when we're in the room, it's about one piece of legislation. And so an invitation to just kind of share thoughts is great. Although part of me last night was thinking I could probably talk for about 6 hours about stuff. So my hope today is to give you a little context about what I do. As the chair said, talk a little bit about, forest fragmentation, touch on old forests. But I think, my main goal today is to allow a chance for a question and answer and talking about what you guys want to talk about. So if I start rambling on about, something that I get jazzed about, bring me in, tell me to shut up and ask a question. So I think this morning you heard from Eric Sorensen, Jimmy Fidel, a couple others, hopefully laying out some context around Vermont's forests, what we look to them for, how important they are. But I guess, zooming way out from my perspective, Vermont is smack dab right in the middle of the Northern Forest. The Northern Forest is the largest intact temperate broadleaf forest left anywhere in the world, which I think is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, actually, could you say that and slower? Yeah. I really understand it.
So the Northern Forest, or also called the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion, it spans over 80 million acres. It encompasses the eastern edge of North America, and it forms the last largest ecologically intact temperate broadleaf forest anywhere in the world. We have big forests elsewhere in the world. Think about the Amazon, think about parts of northern Russia. But as far as this kind of forest, this is the biggest one we've got left. And it's also unique and uniquely challenged.
Yeah. Last largest.
It is the last largest ecologically intact temperate broadleaf forest anywhere in the world. And we're really thinking about, this area that spans 2 countries, 5 states, and 2 provinces. This is when we think about this ecoregion, this Northern Forest area. And Vermont is, positioned smack dab in the middle of it. So not only is this area unique in that it is this, unique forest setting, but it's also uniquely challenged because nowhere else in the world is so much forest land located so close to so many people. Again, thinking about something like the Amazon or other places in the world where there's not that population density. So we have a challenge and maybe an opportunity here as far as what we're looking at. And it's important for a host of reasons. I mean, it's not only defining the place that we call home, but it's a carbon sink, as everyone here knows. It's a crossroads for wildlife, not just thinking about our charismatic species that kind of might go from one end to the other, things like bear, moose, wolf, catamount, but also our little songbirds, right? Some of these species have more than 90% of their global breeding population here, literally right here. So the importance of our forests for a host of ecological reasons, climate reasons are very important. And it's also their economic importance. They're an economic engine. Our rural communities rely on them. They're what really define these communities. And so we need to think about, again, the people that live here and how they interact with this resource. And then also just thinking about the importance of forests to Vermonters. If we go back through our history, looking at things like the report on the Council of Future in Vermont from 2009, one of the most important things that Vermonters put forward was our forests, our working landscape. Out of that was the creation of the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative. So we've seen the importance of these things really drive policy in a way that I think has been great. And then you look at some of the recent work VCR did on the Vermont proposition, that looked at the pandemic and put forward a set of common ideas to drive action and advance actions for a successful and resilient future. And that same pattern emerged around the importance of Vermont's working landscape, natural lands, our forests, to Vermonters. So we see that to continue to be a really high priority for Vermonters. So thinking about the Vermont context, it might have come up earlier today, but Vermont's about 75% forested. Approximately 80% of Vermont's lands are privately owned. So the management and stewardship of those lands are going to be very important to crafting, a path to maintaining an intact and functional landscape, and really a foundation for our working lands economy and the communities of Vermonters that depend on it. And so when we think about the stewardship of those private lands, that's where folks like me, consulting foresters, come in and where we get to play outside. So when I think broadly about kind of, goal setting for what we do, and if I could kind of bring something down to maybe a three-pronged approach or a three-tiered stool, that metaphor we like to think about, I would say that when I think about our work, what we're really driving for is a resilient landscape, one that is ecologically and functionally intact, one that looks at mitigation opportunities, thinking about natural climate solutions, not only things that we can do on the landscape to build mitigation measures, but thinking about the built environment connections there as well. And then I think about economic resilience. That key about vibrant rural communities and their intersection with our forests is also key. So all of those are connected and they're all dependent on each other. You remove one of those pieces from the equation and the other ones won't work. So it's important that we keep everything framed as we kind of think forward about that. One of the points that I was asked to talk about today is fragmentation. And I think Jamie Fidel might have been in here earlier talking about kind of pattern. Oh, hey, Jamie. So I won't kind of go on as far as patterns go. And we can talk about impacts of fragmentation a little bit if you want to. I think most everybody probably knows that fragmentation is detrimental to the health of our forests, their productivity, their economic vitality. Fragmentation, over time leads to forest loss. It impacts the health, the integrity, the resilience of our forests, and it impacts the ability to practice forestry. Smaller and smaller parcels get more challenging to practice active management on. So there's an impact to what we can actually do out on the landscape as well. So thinking about fragmentation and, what do we do about it? There's many tools that we've got in our toolkit. As a forester, my first goes to forest stewardship. How can we direct our actions at climate adaptation and resilience on various scales in our forest? And these are things that we think about on a landscape scale. We think about things like ecologically significant treatment areas in the current use program, landscape settings of ecological sensitivity, or management practices that we can actually employ. Climate adapted forestry is one of the terms that gets used now, but this goes back almost a decade from work at the Forest Service, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, NIAC. We were actually some of the first groups in the northern part of the state with Colorado, Canada, to take that kind of guide they developed to say, here's how you can practice active management in a way that builds resiliency into the forest, that looks at these concepts around resiliency and adaptation to the effects of climate change. I think the effects of climate change are all pretty clear to people. Temperature changes are one, but as we're seeing variations in weather and extreme weather events, whether it's, the windstorm that knocked out power for 8 days at my house around Christmas, or the massive fluctuations in precipitation that we're seeing, or the fact that I'd be hard pressed to find one logger in the state right now who has had success freezing in a job this winter. So there's big impacts there in terms of climate. And then on the actual kind of ecological players out there, the species we work with, not only wildlife and their movements and how they interact with the landscape, but also actual plant species, whether they're tree species or the really amazing little spring ephemerals we find on the forest floor in May. All of these things are impacted by climate change. And so thinking about how we can kind of work in our forests on various scales to make them better adapted to these changes and resilient to them is a big part of what I do. Other tools, thinking about limiting forest fragmentation and things that we have at our, in our toolkit. The current use program is a huge one. I think the current use program, warts and all, it's not completely perfect, but I think it's one of the best programs the state of Vermont ever developed. 2 million acres enrolled in that is a massive success. And I would even argue that just that program alone has I don't want to say bought us time, but bought us time to figure out some of the stuff we're trying to figure out now, and make those decisions. 60% of all private forest land in the state is enrolled in the program. And so when we think about a point of intersection with landowners to talk about the importance of our forests, to talk about forest management, talk about these ecological principles, and really as a state to kind of set objectives and a statement of purpose, I think that program is pretty important and something that we can continue to look to. Other things at our disposal, thinking about forest fragmentation, conservation easements. I sit on the board of the Vermont Land Trust. Conservation easements are a huge tool. And those are, I want to be clear that when we talk about conservation easements, we're talking about working with willing landowners. This isn't something going in and taking away property rights or something like that. It's working with willing landowners to conserve these lands, both working lands and passively managed lands, to keep them functionally intact. And it's been really important. I looked at the successes of the champion lands in northeastern Vermont, in the Atlas timberlands, kind of around my neck of the woods in Montgomery in that area. And these lands are still intact. They're still open. They provide a host of benefits, from public recreation to wood products production to natural community protection. And some of the scales they look at are really important too when we think about how you can create that tryout approach on an individual landscape with reserves and more intensively managed areas. So conservation easements are a huge tool. The forest products economy is a huge partner in this too. We talk about the conservation multiplier effect. One of the tools to keep forest land intact is to keep the ownership of forest land economically viable. It's not the only one, but if you remove that part of the equation, you're going to find it collapse. And so keeping a vibrant forest products economy and really tying that to some of the climate solutions that we're thinking about, things like mitigation in the landscape, but also thinking about product replacement and new sources of energy security. You think about some of the thermal applications we're working on now, some of the much higher efficiency applications. We think about some of the product replacements like mass timber for concrete. I look at what the Fairbanks Museum is doing with some of their demonstration projects, other projects that are cropping up in the state. And then thinking again about kind of the thermal applications, I can look at the mill that just reopened in Richford just above me, which is making pellets now. And they've had a huge success sourcing material hyper locally and also marketing locally. It used to be if you went into Ace Hardware or Bates in Enosburg, you'd find stacks of pellets that were all produced up north in Canada. The ones that they've got there now are produced about 2 miles away, using material that was harvested by local loggers on landscapes that are owned by our neighbors and community members. And so you think about the reduction of inputs there and things like that. So we have opportunities there looking at the forest economy to both build resiliency in our forests, keep them as forests, and also kind of bring in that climate adaptation, climate resiliency angle. With all these, it's nuanced, right? There's not one magic bullet, one solution. There's good and bad with all of it. And the how we do it is also equally as important. So I don't want to just kind of gloss over that like it's a simple solution. Land use policy is another thing that we have in our toolbox. Think about fragmentation. One area is local planning and zoning. We can look to Act 171 and some of the objectives there, thinking about how we can really, provide this tool for municipal implementation of forest integrity planning and put some more support there. Thinking kind of zooming out statewide, we can look to Act 250. I know that's a trigger word for a lot of people, but there's changes in Act 250 that we can think about making that could potentially limit forest fragmentation in some of our largest forest blocks. And I just want to add too that when we think about Act 250, there's changes that could kind of increase its jurisdiction and power over certain landscapes, thinking about forests. But there's other Act 250 tweaks we can make that would also support the forest products industry in rural communities. Some of these were passed last year, thinking about hours of operation for wood products companies. So that was fantastic to see. But there's other tweaks we can make as well, I think, going forward around how we can strengthen areas that we want to see while protecting other attributes that we want to protect as well. And then I think kind of lastly, in terms of the toolbox that I see for mitigating fragmentation is the idea of planning and the importance of planning. That old adage, failing to plan is planning to fail. And there's, a couple interesting examples we can look to there. One is the work right now around the Forest Futures Roadmap project, really thinking about how do we build a vibrant forest economy for the future, one that looks at the needs of our communities, but also thinks about climate, really centered in what does this future world look like and how do we fit into that? And then we think about planning more on a landscape level. I think about last biennium with the 30 by 30 plan that was floated. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. When we think about the moment we're in and the need for this, I think we've all heard it, we've all seen it, things are changing, and it's not just climate change and those impacts, but it's the movement of people. I mean, how many of us saw over the past 2 years the housing markets in our town go absolutely nuts? Properties changing hands at rates that we've never seen before, and we're seeing development patterns shift in ways that are a little concerning. And some of the things, in a way, act in ways that we might not intend them to. So I think about broadband development, right? So when we get broadband to the very end of North Hill Road in Montgomery, that's going to mean that development patterns are going to shift in that area. We're going to see different things happening, and we're already starting to see those happen. So I think when we look at the trends that we're seeing, we need to really think critically about how we're going to mitigate their impact on the forest resources that we care about, and how we plan for things like this goal of 30 by 30, which I think is a laudable goal. Recently there was even more international buy-in to that idea up in Montreal. And so I think that, we're a small state, but we tend to punch above our weight. And I think that putting some real thought in behind that is really important. I think really at the base of it is that we need to have a credible conversation about, how to meet those targets. So I think, that's just a really quick overview of my thoughts on fragmentation. I'm happy to dig in more on that topic with you. As far as old forests go, and that was another point I was asked to speak to. I think old forests are great. I think, being in them can border on a spiritual experience sometimes. That might sound a little touchy-feely, but they play a really important part in our landscape. I think one important thing we need to think about is, first off, is how are we defining old forests? I think Eric was in here earlier talking about conservation design. And I don't know if you touched on it or not in too much detail, but when we think about old growth forests, that's a pretty specific definition. It doesn't just get at age, it gets at structural complexity, it gets at history of land use. And so when we talk about old forests, we need to have a very clear definition of what it is we're talking about. Only in the past couple of years, or really even year, there's other kind of terminology that's popped up around this, talking about maturity and mature forests. And there's some risk there, because when we start talking about things like that are less well defined, we start to lose our ability to really kind of understand what we're talking about. Mature forests, what does that mean? Maturity can be talked about in very different ways. There's biological maturity. Some of these trees out here in our forests can live to be 250 years old. There's economic maturity, when we think about kind of when does that tree reach its highest and best use in the marketplace, which is very different than biological maturity. And then there's some kind of new metrics that get thrown around with, I guess, what I would say are arbitrary, ages that get thrown out there by folks like, say, Carole King. And so I think it's really important that we understand what it is we're talking about when we deal with old forests. And I do think also that when we talk about old forests, we have to talk about them in the context of everything else in the landscape that's important to us and that we're working towards. It's just one of the many targets in VCRD. It's not just the only one. And we have made significant progress. There's about 218,000 acres that it's going to likely develop under current conditions, thinking about forever wild easements. But that's, a fraction of the 420,000 that we're thinking about as a target, that 9% of the landscape. And I think that we've made some really interesting and positive steps with some of the tweaks to current use we've seen in the last biennium, this forest reserve program and in current use. I think that was a very modest and fair and good compromise, trying to weigh different objectives to see if we can build in kind of these objectives around VCRD and retention and development of old forests on our landscape. So I think we are seeing kind of positive movement there. I think the only other thing I'd really kind of just make sure to put out there when we talk about old forests is that we can't forget the ability for ecologically based forestry to advance old forest conditions and characteristics. There's importance in thinking about both passive management and restoration. The solution in a lot of landscapes isn't simply just walking away. And in a lot of our forests, I'd argue that that could even be detrimental to this long-term goal of developing old forest conditions in the landscape. So it's complex, right? And that's not just to be a pun on the forest complexity of old forests, but it's there's a lot that goes into this and how to get there. And so I would argue that old forests and passive versus active, it's not an either or, it's a yes and when we think about those things. So that's kind of a lot all at once, a brain dump, I guess you could call it. But I'd have to pause now and kind of just open it up for questions or.
Yeah, I have a question for you, but Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So, old forest, has there been any mapping done about where those would be in the state?
Yeah, I think probably Eric would be better suited to talk about this with his prior work with Fish and Wildlife. I do know that there's been some work. I don't believe there's been an exhaustive, map of all of it. I'm not 100% sure what the current, state of that effort would be, though.
The old forest would be mature forest, or is that different?
Yeah. So again, maturity. What are we talking about when we talk about old forests? And again, we think very critically about how do we meet that definition of old growth. Again, it's forest age, it's structural complexity, it's the amount of coarse woody debris on the forest floor. It's all these things coming together. So that would be kind of the main metric to use to measure what it is on the landscape.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I would love it if you could talk a little bit more about kind of managing for old forest characteristics and climate. You use the term climate adapted forestry. If you could flesh that out for you. But if I own a forest land and I say, hey, I've learned all this great stuff in committee, you're my forester, would you help me both have an active management plan where I could sell some timber and manage for old forest characteristics? What are you going to do for me?
Yeah. So let's separate those out a little bit right off the top. And when we talk about managing for old forest characteristics, a lot of this comes from work right here in the state with a gentleman named Bill Keaton at UVM, who I would strongly recommend you guys have in to talk to you if you're interested in this. But Bill Keaton's research, going back to when he was a professor of mine at UVM, is really looking at around this idea of structural complexity enhancement. And again, when we think about old forests, it's not just the age of the trees, but it's that overall structure of the forest, the processes working in there. And so what Bill's work did is it looked at how can we accelerate the development of those characters on the landscape. So it's not just leaving, reserve trees to grow bigger. It's how do we do things very intentionally. For example, this is the one that always stuck with me, but there's a technique where you can actually use a cannonball and a chain to knock the crown out of a tree to create a large standing dead tree in the forest. It's not used all that often, but that stuck with me from this class. But there's the ideas of how do you create those structural characteristics that are found in these forests. So there are practices, and again, I would defer to Bill to talk in more detail around kind of what those are. Thin layered kind of almost like a Venn diagram, right, is this climate adaptive forestry. And a lot of this, like I said, came out of early work from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, the U.S. Forest Service. And I'd be happy to email you. It's a 2-pager that I put in every forest management plan that I have that outlines about 14 principles here. But really, when you think about, big picture managing for climate adaptation, one of the keys is complexity, structural complexity. Age class development, structural diversity in the landscape, elements that make the forest more resilient to disturbance. One of the things that we're going to be seeing more and more of with climate change is disturbance, big wind events, big weather events. And so if you think about, this is a really kind of simple example, but if you have a even age stand of white pine, all 60 years old, evenly out in rows, and a wind event comes in and knocks them down, you're starting from scratch. Now, if you have a stand that over time has had gap development with new tree species coming up and the intermediate canopy and pockets of regeneration developing, when a disturbance event comes in, that forest is already more well positioned to kind of rebound much more quickly. Other elements of it are thinking about things like invasive species. One of the things with climate change we're going to see more and more of is invasive species and their impact on the landscape. And so managing not only for invasive species control, but also for resiliency against them. How do we manage our forests so that they're more resilient to the encroachment of those species? We think about forest roads, right? If we're out working in our forests, practicing active management, there's infrastructure that gets developed there. And we have things like the Vermont AMPs, which are fantastic, which are now based in a really neat little cell phone app that you can all check out and bring out into your own forests. But we're also thinking about things around designing roads in a way where they'll essentially shed water more easily. So it's not just about putting in, say, water bars at certain intervals, but it's about pitching roads at an angle so that they'll shed water more. These are kind of really simplistic examples, but it's a whole host of tools that we can put out in the landscape that make them more resilient to disturbance and significant weather events.
Thanks, Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Charlie, great presentation. I can tell you probably could talk for 6 hours, probably. A good segue. You just mentioned under climate adaptation and invasive species. And my question was going to be, we're seeing an arrival of or distinction of certain species regarding the bees, birds, and bugs and things. And you're in Montgomery, up the further part of the state. And I know down south we've had the emerald ash borer and the invasive ticks that we're seeing. And I'm wondering, boots on the ground, are you seeing any evidence of this that far north? Or can you talk to a little bit about how we're preparing for that climate adaptation?
Yeah, so depends on kind of which individual pest we're talking about. Something like hemlock woolly adelgid, that's still pretty much down in southern Vermont, but emerald ash borer is up around us. Luckily, Montgomery, we haven't seen it yet, but it's surrounding us. I found it in Franklin, it's above us in Canada, it's to the south of us, so it's a matter of time. So with something like emerald ash borer specifically, what we're doing is we're thinking about things like, one is thinking about the size of tree the insect will attack and how can we stimulate greater regeneration in ash in our forests as a mechanism to basically hedge our bets, get that next age class established. So when the insect moves through, it might kill the overstory, but you're going to have that next age class established so that that pest moves through. It might linger, but we have those trees there. The caveat being that we're still learning a lot about this, and so again, it's that case of biding our time until we can maybe hopefully develop a more comprehensive strategy there. We're thinking about value loss propositions too. Some of our forest types around here are 50+% ash. Gosh, you go to the Champlain Islands and there's forests that are 80% ash out there. And so we're really thinking about how can we work in a way that could help to maintain those landscapes and those species in those areas, leaving, remnant legacy individuals to provide that seed, but also thinking critically about some of these areas where we are going to go in and reduce the ash percentage in there by a fairly significant amount, because, if you see 90% stem mortality, that's a pretty big deal in a forest, and for a forest landowner, a pretty big economic loss. So you're balancing ecological objectives, economic objectives, and then also social objectives. Too. Ash isn't just a forest species; it's a yard species. I have an ash out in my front lawn that I love, and I'm seriously considering doing the injections in it to limit the potential for EAP to get that one. So depending on the scale we're working on, there's different tools that you can apply. But I think at the root of it, what we're trying to do with that or any other kind of pest is to think about ways we can make the forest more resilient and adaptive to their impacts.
Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I was kind of going in a similar direction. Like when I hear the term invasive species, I usually just kind of give up. I feel like it's, number one, just try to prevent it. And then once it comes like purple loosestrife or okay, you can yank it or like too many Canada geese or whatever, you can put stuff around their baby eggs. But it sounds like there are actually some promising things people or we can do. Does that really just kind of push back the invasive species from taking over more quickly? Or I guess what I'm asking is, do you really feel like one can really stop invasive species?
Yeah. It's a good question. In some instances, we have seen success like that. Like you look down at Massachusetts in the Worcester area with how they responded to Asian longhorn beetle. And they were pretty successful in limiting that spread. On the whole, though, I'd say we're in a situation now where these are here, they're going to be here, and we got to live with them. So it's more an idea of how do you adapt? How do you figure out where you can put your resources in the most cost-effective and impactful way? And so when you think about things like invasive species control for, say, woody invasives like buckthorn, honeysuckle, things like that, a lot of times we're really prioritizing areas in the landscape we can do the most good. So we think about the fact that if you are working on a property that has a fair amount of edge on a forest, say it's a farm where you have a lot of field and forest interacting, some of those edges and hedgerows, it's going to be impossible to eradicate completely that species. If you work in the forested setting and you can do some control efforts, either mechanical or chemical control, if the conditions are right, to get them out of there, and then manage the forest in a way to make it less susceptible. So thinking about things like these species love disturbances, they love sunlight. So can we manage the forest in a way that tries to have contiguous forest cover or limit some of those gaps or disturbance opportunities to get them back into the forest? Those are the techniques we're using, or even limiting work along forest edges to kind of limit the encroachment of those species into the forest. So there's techniques we can use to basically make the forest less susceptible to those moving in. But it is an idea of they're here and we're gonna have to live with them and find a way to deal with them. And the reality is that we can only do so much. And so it's really trying to focus our efforts where we're gonna have the biggest impact.
If I can ask a follow-up, you don't seem like, I tend to just feel like it's super negative. You seem kind of positive, like there are ways to work with it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, I mean, doing what I do for a living, you can't be super negative. You'd go crazy. And so I don't want to paint like an overly rosy picture, but I tend to look at the positive. I tend to think about what can we do out there? What can we do with landowners on landscapes with a variety of management tools to make our forests more resilient to these things. Yeah.
Charlie, can you talk a little bit about your work with Cold Hollow to Canada? And
Yeah. So Cold Hollow to Canada, it was formed about 10 years ago. The genesis of it was we got about 100 people together in a gymnasium at a high school, laid out maps of our 7-town region and said, here's a bunch of markers, show us what's important to you. People were drawing big circles around areas where they liked to hike. Use that for green, use the red to circle sugar bushes, use the blue to places you fish or where do you hike. And so people made just messes of these maps. And then we brought them back and we inputted all of the layers or circles they created into a GIS system. And each color represented a human value. So each one of those got a layer in the GIS system: hunting and fishing, sugaring, timber management, wildlife recreation. And we stacked them all up. And when we stacked them up on the landscape, we saw certain areas that had more human-related values than others, areas that were obviously more important to the people in these communities. And then the light bulb really went off when we overlaid some of the early forest block analysis work the state had done around where are our most highest importance and largest forest blocks in the state. And there was a direct correlation. The areas that were most important to people were also the most ecologically important. And at that point, we said there's something here, right? And so we developed an organization that grew to become Cold Hollow to Canada. And we work kind of around 3 different pillars. One is community engagement and outreach, thinking about working with our conservation commissions and planning commissions, getting back to things like Act 171. We work with our forest landowners around forest stewardship. We have a program called the Woodlots Program, which brings together landowners on a shared landscape to think about aggregated management or landscape level management, acknowledging that everyone's got their own objectives and we respect that, but there's opportunities to kind of leverage greater impact or dovetail certain things together or increase the cumulative impact of what we're doing. We want to jump on those. We've also found it's a really neat tool to get landowners together under a peer-to-peer model so that they're sharing information. It's one thing for me to walk in and say, I'm an expert, I'm here to help. It's something else for neighbors to talk with neighbors and to say, hey, we've done this on our forest, come for a walk on our property and see what we've done. And maybe you can do that too. And then the third pillar of our work is around conservation easements. We've got a goal of doubling the amount of conserved forest land in our region by 2030. We're about 15% of the way right now. So the next 10 years for us are really going to be focusing on that work. But the idea is to essentially double the amount of conserved forest land. And that's both, lands that would be passively managed, but predominantly working forests. And I think it's important to talk about too, that, we talk about working forests on any individual tract of land. There's a diversity of management techniques being employed. You could have more intensive management on one area, a little bit more light touch management here, and then areas that are passively managed. So it's not like there's a one or another from any kind of individual, parcel perspective.
So when you say doubling, from what date and from how much?
Yeah, so I'm the worst person in the world at remembering numbers, but I want to say what sticks out in my head is 23,000 acres is our target, an additional 23,000 acres. And like I said, I think we're about 15% of the way there. We have recently pulled together a whole host of conservation partners, both national, regional, and state, to come up with mechanisms for advancing that work. Conservation easements take time and they take money. Forest land easements are also particularly challenging in that there's less money. We have a great history of farmland easements in the state. A lot of that work has been funded through mechanisms like the NRCS ASAP program that provides money for ag land conservation. There's been less of that in the forested setting. And it's created a little bit of challenge because if you go to a forest landowner and say, hey, would you love to donate a conservation easement on your property? They'll often look at you and say, well, my neighbor, the farmer, got paid for his. Why can't I get paid for mine? And so one of our challenges, but also opportunities that we're trying to create is to build funds to work with landowners around sales or bargain sales, or at a minimum cover the associated costs with an easement. Because, you could look at the development of a conservation easement on a property, just the input costs alone in terms of legal, say a survey, stewardship, appraisal, you might be looking at $120,000, just for that one, just the mechanics of it, let alone any kind of purchase or bargain sale for that easement. So that's where a lot of our work has been driven now, as far as kind of ramping that end of it to really put the hammer down on that number that we want to reach.
Thank you. Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So conservation easement, can you elaborate on that a little bit, what that entails? Does that mean, well, just like,
yeah. So a conservation easement, the way it was initially described to me, which has always stuck with me, is that we think about your rights as a landowner as a bundle of sticks. You've got the right to recreate and love your property, the right to hunt and fish, the right to cut timber, the right to mineral extraction, the right to develop it, all these things. And a conservation easement is essentially saying you're going to take that right of development and transfer it to a third party that will hold that in perpetuity. That third party could be a local land trust like the Greensboro Land Trust. It could be a statewide entity like the Vermont Land Trust. It could be the federal government. They hold easements on forested parcels in the state. But the idea is that this third party in perpetuity will hold the development rights to the property and that they will steward that easement, essentially make sure that the stipulations in the conservation easement are met forever and ever. So that's where that stewardship endowment, the money to make sure that happens. And the easements themselves are really tailored to the individual properties. Some things there to keep in mind would be that, when an individual landowner enters into a conservation easement agreement, there's some really important discussions around what's in and what's out. Does a landowner want to reserve an area for potential future development? Do the kids want to build a house? Do we want to have a lot to sell to send Jimmy to college, or, hedging your bets, kind of like that? There's ways that you can do things like that sunset over time. So for example, you could have a reserved area out of the easement, which would not transfer to a new owner on your death, right? So there's some pretty intricate mechanisms of how easements can be developed and what they protect. Most conservation easements also have standards of management. So they kind of say, here's the baseline of what is acceptable management on this property, things that outline particulars there. A lot of easements will also have stipulations around, reserve areas. So many of them that are developed, especially now, look at things like, okay, you've got this really sensitive natural community in one area, and we're going to limit motor vehicle access to that area, say. So no ATVs in this northern hardwood seepage forests, or no new trail development there. So the level of specificity can kind of vary depending on the easement. But at the root of it, it's basically saying that now and forever, as that property passes from owner to owner, that right of development is held by a third party that will hold that and enforce it over time.
So they would have the jurisdiction or a say in how that's developed.
Yes, they would, well, or not developed, I guess you could say is kind of the key with the development angle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
One more thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is the impact of fragmentation on forestry. So when we hear that, like parcelization and subdivision can affect the economies of scale for forestry, you could sort of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So at the root of it is that the smaller the parcel is, the more challenging it can be to create the economy of scale to make active management feasible. If you've got a property that is, say, 10 acres to mobilize an operation, get equipment out there, do the work, the return just isn't there to make it worthwhile. That's kind of an oversimplification. There's instances where that's not true. I mean, it can depend on the character of the property, what's there, how it's being managed. But on the whole, as properties get smaller and smaller, they do get more difficult to manage from that economy of scale. And then when we think about the actual impacts of fragmentation on management itself, there's physical kind of things that can happen with fragmentation. Now, some fragmentation could just be 100-acre lot gets cut in half. It's now 250-acre lots. There's a boundary line in there, and that's all that happens. But typically when you see fragmentation, it leads to some sort of development on that property. They sell 50 acres, that person wants to build a house. Where's the house go is an important question. Does it go in that far southern corner, leaving a fair amount of intact forest to work around? Does it go in the middle of the property, which creates an even greater kind of impacted area? There's different metrics that are out there around the impact of a house development on a forested setting. And there's different metrics people use around, is it ecological impact? Is it wildlife impact? But one that I saw recently was that, a 14-acre envelope around a house is kind of what is impacted by the presence of that house. And then the impact of the development of roads and stuff can also impact, forests. Roads are great for access. We need roads if we're going to be working in forests, but roads also provide an opportunity for the introduction of things like invasive species. How many times have we seen something around a road where you come in and the ditches get redone and all of a sudden you've got Phragmites in the ditch, or that disturbance opens up an area where you've got disturbed soil, sunlight, and a bird that happens to drop honeysuckle on the ground or something like that. So there's different levels of impact. But I think that on the whole, to your question with fragmentation and the ability to practice forestry, it's really that diminishing parcel size can create a challenge to the economy of scale to get active work done.
And I think current use is 25 acres to be enrolled as forest land. So
Yep.
that a viable amount of land for active forest management?
So it depends on the parcel, really. It depends on the parcel, it depends on what you're talking about as forest management goes. I can tell you that it's more challenging, certainly. It's more challenging to, get a logging job going on a property like that, especially if it's already a economically marginal job. A lot of the work we do out in the woods isn't going out and cutting big bomber gun barrel straight 22-inch veneer quality sugar maple. It's cutting a lot of crap. It's cutting firewood. It's cutting pulpwood. It's really looking at that improvement over time of that forest condition. High grading is cutting the best and leaving the rest. I find a lot of my time is low grading. It's pulling out that low grade material, leaving that higher quality material to grow over time for that host of benefits that we want. And so, when we're thinking about lower grade material with limited market value, we're thinking about the things that we see right now in markets. I mean, we could talk all day about what are commonly referred to as low grade markets, but thinking about things that won't go for saw timber, veneer, so pulpwood, Those markets are incredibly challenged right now across the Northeast. And even, with our sawlog markets, Vermont, like so many things, is not a price setter, it's a price getter. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but we're at the whim of a global economic system. And so it's really challenging. And get back to the original point, as it gets smaller and smaller, your challenges there get amplified.
Well, thank you. Okay. One last question.
Quick question.
Tori.
About workforce, because it's always on our minds. As we improve and we reach this ideal state, we're going to need more foresters. Is that something that you think the pipeline is good and robust in Vermont?
Yeah, I do, in that I work with students from UVM, I work with students from Paul Smith's College across the lake. I see that next crop, coming forward. And so I know that they're there, and I think that's great. And there's nothing better than getting out in the woods with a bunch of students. That being said, we're already seeing challenges, out there with the ability of folks to find foresters. We're seeing a lot of retirements. And we're not seeing that quite get as backfilled in a way. The one bright spot I will say is, I work with a local tech center in Enosburg, and those I think are real bright spots on more of the high school, that age group setting, to think about opportunities around forestry, the practice of forestry, but also things that are involved with the forest economy, and how to set folks up for success there, and in a way that realistically takes into account what their objectives are around secondary education and opportunities there. So,
Well, thank you so much for coming in.
thanks. Can I just add one final thought around this?
Yeah.
So the one thing about the conversation with forestry and forests and how we manage them, I think it's been great that in the past few years, we've seen more and more attention on this. That's fantastic. I think this should be like everybody's front and center issue in the state. But one thing that we are seeing more and more of, like everything in our world these days, is contention around it, and fighting and headbutting. And I guess I see that we are slipping a little bit into, especially in the media landscape, creating this false dichotomy around there's logging and there's no logging, there's passive management and there's active management. And it creates a conversation, or it limits the ability to have a realistic conversation around it. And I just want to just put a warning out there that we're not going to come to solutions we need if we kind of slip into that false dichotomy. In terms of a passive approach, there's certainly opportunity on the landscape for a passive approach to management. There's places where we should, by all means, taking that approach, but we can't bank everything on that. Ecological variation, the variety of scenarios and contexts that we work in our forests, altered disturbance regimes, just the context of land use history and secondary forests, and the idea of avoided displacement of impacts of forestry and logging. We can't just put all our eggs in one basket. And so there's certain concepts out there that tend to put forward a very strong passive management approach as the only alternative in some contexts to active management. And I just need to say that I think that is probably the worst direction we can go, is to lean into that false dichotomy. It's divided the community at a time when we really need to be promoting both the creation of forest reserves and looking critically at the improvement of our management of our forests to meet the challenges of climate change. And so if I can just leave you with one thing, I just think that's kind of the takeaway that we need to really think about, is that it's not an this or that, it's a yes and to both of those. So thanks very much.